Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're listening. I see that we've got people here on the East Coast and people out in Colorado. Thanks for joining us today. I'm really excited for today's presentation. This issue of osteoporosis is a really big, important one to me. I deal with it with patients almost every day here in my office. There's a lot of misinformation, a lot of lack of proper understanding, and hopefully that's what today's all about, is understanding how nature intended things to work in regard to osteoporosis. So I see a few more people that are settling in, and so I just want to give them a chance to get completely hooked in. And so I'm just going to give a little background about myself for those of you who have not heard one of our webinars before. I'm Brian Sanderoff. I'm a holistic pharmacist. What that means is that I'm a traditionally trained pharmacist, and I used to own my own pharmacies. In fact, 2 pharmacies at one time in downtown Baltimore. And at some point, I sort of got tired of doing that count, pour, lick, stick type and gripe thing, realizing that giving people the medicines that they were getting for chronic diseases was not really helping them. And the medicines that are used for osteoporosis is a really good example of that I'll talk about a little bit later. I also want to say that I am very open to answering your questions and hearing your feedback and trying to help you as much as I can. Part of my mission with the work that I do is to act as a resource for people in this world where there's a lot of misinformation about medicine and herbs and nutrients and that whole realm. And so please do not hesitate to get in touch with me. Do not hesitate to call me. You can go to the website, wellbeinggps.com. And all the ways that you need to be able to get in touch with us are there. And I'm very open to answering your questions. Let's see. Also, for today's presentation, unfortunately, I can't have people participate with their voices because there's so many of you, and what ends up happening is it really muddles the presentation because we get a bunch of people talking at one time. And so all of you are muted, but you do have the opportunity to ask questions in that little question box. So just type a question in if you have one, and it will show up, and I will answer that question when it's appropriate. So if it's something that I'm talking about right then and there that you have a question about, then just type it right in. I'll get right to it. And if it's something that shows up later in the presentation, then we'll do that. So I think we've had plenty of time for people to get in and get settled. And so let's go ahead and get started. So again, osteoporosis, understanding how nature really intended things to work. The first thing I want to talk about is this concept that's called homeostasis. And I have to tell you that very first lecture in pharmacy school some 25 years ago, I'm afraid to admit, we went over this concept of homeostasis and what it means. And so I want to give you a definition. It's very important to understand there's a lot of definitions. If you just Googled homeostasis, you'd find a lot of definitions out there. But here's one that I thought really spoke appropriately. And so homeostasis refers to the body's ability to physiologically regulate its inner environment to ensure its stability in response to fluctuations in the outer environment. And so what that means basically is that your body will do whatever it has to do to maintain life. And many, many chronic diseases are really nothing more than homeostasis in action. And so here's a couple examples of that. High blood pressure. And so I just want to go through these a little bit so that you understand the concept here. And so with high blood pressure, here's what happens. Let's imagine that as you're getting a little bit older, your blood pressure is tending to go up. And that's what we see most often with folks. They get into their 50s and their 60s, and all of a sudden their blood pressure starts to inch up a little bit. It's not like you wake up one morning and it's toxic, a really high blood pressure that way. Well, the reason it happens is because just like a hose that's left out in the sun all summer long, your blood vessels get stiff. And when they get stiff, it takes more pressure from the pump, which is the heart, to move blood around. Now, recognize that blood's job is to deliver oxygen and nutrition and pull away waste from all the tissues. And so if the pipes going around your body, the blood vessels are stiffer, and it takes more pressure to have the body do its job, the body will make that adjustment. And so that's a perfect example of homeostasis in action. Another one would be depression. Back in caveman times, if the leader of the cave were to die in some sort of accident or, a rock fall or fall off a cliff or an animal were eat him or whatever, the whole troop would get a little bit depressed. And what that meant is that they would sort of keep a little bit closer to home. They wouldn't venture out as far until a new leader emerged that could help them safely interact with their environment. Again, it's homeostasis. And as you're about to find out, osteoporosis is maybe the perfect example of the body doing exactly what it's supposed to do based on the influences that we give it from the outside world. So this is the part of the presentation where I always have to apologize. I'm a bit of a biochemistry nerd, and I really enjoy understanding how the body works on that microscopic biochemical level. And sometimes we have to get a little bit technical in our presentation of this information because, in my mind, it's important to understand the underlying process if you're going to understand what's the best way to interact or change with that process. So again, I apologize, and I try not to make this too technical. So there's a couple players that play a role with the body being able to maintain the integrity of the bones. One of those players are called osteoblasts, and they're responsible for bone formation. So these are literally the bone builders. And what they do is they lay down a grid of collagen that then gets filled in with the bone matrix. And I'm sure you've seen highway workers building a new highway where they lay out that metal rebarb in this grid and then they pour the concrete in. And that rebarb helps strengthen the whole process and the whole concrete. And it's the same thing with the body, if that makes sense to you. Another player in this dance, if we want to call it that, is called the osteoclasts. Now they're responsible for bone resorption, and so these are large Pac-Man-like cells that go around and find old brittle bone and sort of eat it up, recycling the minerals and using them, making it so that the body can reuse those minerals. And I'll also tell you that after they do that process, they sort of leave a kind of a breadcrumb trail, not actual breadcrumbs, but sort of a biochemical breadcrumb trail, which tells the osteoblasts, the builders, where to actually build new bone. And so you have this process which is known as bone remodeling. And it's this dance, as I said, that is constantly played where what you're doing is finding old brittle bone and get rid of it. That's those Pac-Man osteoclasts. And then the osteoblasts come behind and they build new bone to replace what was just taken away. I also want to point out, and this process goes on in our entire lives. Now, obviously, when we're younger, we don't have a lot of old brittle bone. What we have is a need for new bone, and our structure, our skeleton is actually growing. And then we hit a point where we kind of hit a medium where the amount of bone building is equal to the amount of the bone getting broken down. And for many reasons, as we get older, that gets out of balance and more bone gets broken down than built. And we'll talk about how to sort of reverse this. But there's a hormonal connection here that I just want to talk about. There's many hormones involved, including things like vitamin D and hormones that come from your parathyroid and your thyroid. And two hormones in particular I want to mention. One, estrogen, is responsible for helping the osteoclasts, or they're the ones that control the osteoclasts, and progesterone, which are the ones that control the osteoblasts. The progesterone is the one that controls the building of bone as we go through life. So what are the risks? Oh, so look, sorry, I keep forgetting I have this slide here. So here's a picture of it. So you have in that top piece, you've got the a bone which is normal. And so you have an sort of an equal balance between the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts. The osteoclasts are those big pink ones, and the osteoblasts are those little green ones. And if you look at the bottom part, it shows where you can get osteoporosis or thinning of the bone, and that's where you have too many osteoclasts, or the osteoclasts are working too hard, and the osteoblasts are not doing their job. The building isn't getting done as well, as quickly, or as efficiently as the breaking down is happening. So what are the risk factors for osteoporosis here? Well, genetics plays a part with this. So if you're listening and you have a mom that has osteoporosis, then you should be paying even more attention. Now, that doesn't mean that you should necessarily be taking a prescription medicine for this. Honestly, neither should mom, most likely. But this means that you are forewarned. And with our genes, as I've spoken many times on other webinars, our genes have the opportunity to express themselves in different ways. So if you have a genetic link to osteoporosis, what that means is that that's sort of like the weakness. It's a genetic predisposition towards that problem. Do your genes ever have to express themselves in the negative and show that problem? No, they do not. And many of the things that we'll be talking about today are how to get your genes to express themselves in a different way. Lifestyle, very, very important. As you'll find out later, there are 3 things that you can do to prevent and or reverse osteoporosis that all have to do with lifestyle. Dietary protein plays a very important role with this. We'll talk a lot about diet and its effect on osteoporosis. Smoking and alcohol are definitely things that contribute to osteoporosis or risk factors for osteoporosis. Exercise, and that doesn't mean getting, it means lack of exercise. And then there are medications. Maybe it's more common to know or understand that steroids can be a problem here. That's well known. But what about those H2 blockers and those proton pump inhibitors, those medicines that we take for reflux, which are very, very common these days? Not just prescription medicine, but over the counter as well. Well, those medicines create a condition where you're more likely to have osteoporosis. Those medicines create a condition where your body does not absorb minerals very efficiently. So if you're on one of those medicines, even more of a reason to, 1, try to find out a way to get off those medicines, and 2, to pay attention to this whole osteoporosis thing. So how do we measure bone density in the first place? Well, there's the DEXA scan, and I put DEXA on here, although the new name for it is actually just DEXA. They still call it DEXA scan, and what that stands for is dual energy X-ray absorptiometry. And basically what they do is they, put 2 beams of X-rays into an area of your bone from different angles, and how that stuff gets absorbed and measured is how they determine your bone density. And the way it works is that they compare you to a 30-year-old bones that have the same, that are the same sex and the same ethnicity that you are. And then you get what's known as a T-score. And that T-score sort of gives you a negative of how you compare to that ideal 30-year-old that's the same sex and the same ethnic background that you are. And so you might have a T-score of -1, which would indicate that you're 1 standard deviation away from that ideal 30-year-old. And we get more excited when people have T-scores into the -2, -2.5 range. I say we, I'm talking about your doctor. I rarely get excited about these things. I want to say a word about accuracy, because I think it's really important to understand that there are definitely some factors that can affect the accuracy of this DEXA scan. And so you could get a score, and that score may not be very accurate for you. The first consideration here is the size of your bones, because you're being compared to a 30-year-old that has a certain bone thickness. And so if you are very thin boned, regardless of how big you are as a person, if you are thin boned, you are going to get an overly negative report on this test. That may not be as accurate for you as we think it is. And if you happen to be very tall, you may get an overly positive score. As far as accuracy goes, also, operator of the equipment is very, very important, because there are no standards throughout the country. Every state has its own regulations about what's required in training. In the state of Maryland, where I am, and where some of our listeners are today, there are no qualifications for a DEXA scan operator. And if technique is not accurate, if technique is not consistent from test to test, you're going to get different results. And we're making life-changing decisions based on those results. And so I think it's important to understand this. And then also, the machine needs to be consistent. And so if you really want to get valuable information from test to test, and these tests are rarely done more often than every 2 years, then you really should insist that you have the same operator on the exact same machine to know that the results are going to be as accurate as possible. And I also put osteopenia there just because I want to mention that that is the name for the very beginning of this process. And so you've got normal bones when they start to thin. In essence, when your T-score is slightly, -0.6, -1, -1.5, you have what's called osteopenia, which is the beginning of this process. And I'm going to use that term later. And then as you get a T-score minus bigger numbers, then it becomes diagnosed as osteoporosis. Are there alternatives? And for this testing, and I want to say that I want to make sure that you understand that there are alternatives. One of the problems with the DEXA scan is that you got to wait a year and a half or 2 years between scans to be able to see useful change. And so let's say you go to the doctor and the doctor says, you need a DEXA scan done. Maybe you're a 50-year-old woman. Maybe you have a family history of osteoporosis. Mom had osteoporosis. And so you get a DEXA scan done so that we can get a baseline of where you are. And let's say the DEXA scan shows some concern. Assuming that accuracy is perfect and that there is some concern, there's some thinning of the bones, you undertake a program. You change your diet, start taking some supplements, you start getting some weight-bearing exercise. You got to wait a year and a half or 2 years to get another DEXA scan done to see whether there's any results from that. And if there aren't any results, then you spent 2 years, doing some things that are probably healthy for you, but not necessarily affecting the osteoporosis the way you want. And so there is an alternative. There's a urine test that will show the biochemical markers of bone loss in your urine. And so what I recommend is that if you are going to undertake a program to help shore up your bones, if you either have concerns or you have family history, you do this urine test first. So that way we have a baseline. And basically what we're measuring is how much bone you're spilling into your urine. The more breakdown of bone, the more those osteoclasts do their work, there are some biochemical markers that are evidence of that work. And so you do that, you get your baseline, and then 3 months later, you have this repeated after making your changes, and then you can see whether you've really stemmed the tide on losing bone or not. And that is a much more reasonable way to go. The cost of this test is around $100. Insurance is probably not going to pay for it. And I say, you know what? I don't care about insurance. What I want to know is what I'm doing is useful or not. So there is an alternative to that. And I also just want to recognize that this concept of secondary outcomes is very important for us to understand in medicine because we do this a lot. We do it with cholesterol. And a secondary outcome basically means that we're looking at a blood test or we're looking at a factor in the body, and then we're going to make changes. In medicine, it's give you a prescription medicine, and then we're going to look at those indicators again. But those indicators don't necessarily mean what we think they mean. And so for cholesterol, as an example, we give you statin drugs in medicine. I don't recommend that, but that's what we do. And then we look at your blood to see if the cholesterol came down. But does that equate to you living any longer? Well, with statin drugs, the answer is no. It does not equate to you living one day longer. So that's called a secondary outcome. And the same thing with this osteoporosis issue. You get a DEXA scan done. It shows that you've got some thinning of the bones. The doctor wants to write a prescription for you like Fosamax or Boniva. And then 2 years later, you get a DEXA scan done, and it shows that you have an increased bone density from what you had before. That does not necessarily equate to less fractures, and sometimes it even means more fractures. And so that's called a secondary outcome. And I just want to point that out because it's one of the ways that in medicine we sort of trick people into thinking we're helping them when maybe we're not really helping them. Hope that makes sense for you. And I just want to remind everybody again, if you have some questions as I'm going through this, just type them right into that little question box and I'll see the question pop up and I'll address it when it's appropriate to do so. Okay, so what is the solution from regular medicine? Well, first of all, I have to tell you that medicine is really good at asking questions. And they classically are good at asking the wrong question. So that's the case with osteoporosis and how we treat osteoporosis in medicine. The question that we asked was, what can we do to slow the breakdown of bones? And because of that, the solutions that we came up with, which were a solution to that question, end up not really making a difference in this issue, and I'll explain why. So the question that we asked in medicine is, what can we do to slow the breakdown of bone? And I'm telling you, that's the wrong question. The answer that we came up with those questions, which was appropriate based on that question, was this group of medicines which are called bisphosphonates. Fosamax, Boniva, Actonel, Zamida, Reclast. These are all under this class which are called bisphosphonates. And these are the popular ones, and you see lots of commercials for them. Sally Field, you see doing commercials for Boniva, although I haven't seen one recently. So what are bisphosphonates and how do they work? Well, what they do is they stop the osteoclasts from doing their job permanently. And that permanently is important to understand. We'll get back to that. So what they do is, again, they slow the breakdown of bone. Osteoclasts go around, they find old brittle bone, and they get rid of it so that new bone can be built. And what these medicines do, these bisphosphonates, again, Fosamax and Boniva and the like, what they do is they stop the breakdown of old brittle bone. Now, if we really think about that, you're starting to understand why I said that medicine asked the wrong question. Because there's a part of your brain that should be saying, wait a second, we're interfering with this dance that's supposed to happen where we're supposed to get rid of old brittle bone and make new bone, and we're keeping around old brittle bone. That doesn't sound like such a good idea. I want to talk about the side effects. There are side effects of these medicines that are known and published and everybody knows about. The first one is the gastrointestinal stuff. And so if you were to get a prescription for Fosamax or Boniva, you would be instructed to not lay down for 30 to 60 minutes after you take the medicine, because these medicines are caustic. And if any of that caustic stuff leaks up into your esophagus, then it's going to cause some problems, some irritation. And there's actually some concern and seeing increased amounts of esophageal cancer with people that are on these medicines. So that's the one that the doctor and the pharmacist will tell you about. There's some cardiovascular concern as well, especially with the injectable ones like Reclast. A fair amount of people end up getting atrial fibrillation from taking these medicines. And we think it has to do with the regulation or the monkeying with blood levels of calcium, which then affect all of that stuff. And so the cardiovascular, again, doctor may not tell you about that one. Here's one that for sure they won't tell you about, but you can see when you watch TV, because for as many commercials that you see for Fosamax, you see lawyers trying to get you on board with them for this big class action suit about these fractures that are happening. And this goes back to basic biochemistry and how they work. And it goes back to that question that we asked wrongly in medicine. What can we do to slow the breakdown of bone? Because all of these medicines create the condition where we are keeping around old, brittle bone. And that is not what we want to do, because you know what? Further down the line, those old brittle bone, regardless of what the DEXA scan says, are more fragile and more susceptible to fracture. And this is what we're finding now. We're finding that people that have been on these medicines for a while have problems with the muscles in their jaws. And now we're starting to see that they're getting unusual breaks in long bones like the femur in the leg, which is very unusual to happen. And the reason it's happening is because this medicine is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's stopping the osteoclasts from doing their job. And so it's keeping around old brittle bone. Hopefully you understand that. I want to talk about statistics and effectiveness. And again, a little bit of an apology for the technical nature of this, but it's really important to understand this. So the first thing is the relative risk versus actual risk. Now, a Fosamax study that was reported in the Journal of the American Medical Association for women with severe osteoporosis, and that means they had a T-score of minus 2.5 or worse, they were treated for 4 years. And, of course, there was a control group that was given a placebo during that whole time. So what they found is that 2.2% of the people that were in the placebo group got fractures that were related to thinning of the bone, and only 1% of the people in the Fosamax group over those 4 years got a fracture related to thinning of the bones. And so the relative risk going from 2.2 to 1 is actually 56% reduction. And so this is what the drug reps are spouting in the doctor's offices. They're going around saying, see this study? That's a 56% decrease in fractures. And when your doctor puts you on Fosamax, that's what he's saying, is that you have a better than 50% chance of not getting a fracture. But that is the relative risk. The actual risk is a 1.2% reduction, not a 56% reduction. Do you understand that? You went from 2.2 to 1. That 56% reduction is not taking into account all the people who wouldn't have had a fracture in either group. And so the actual risk is only lowering at your risk a reduction of 1.2% over those 4 years. So also keep in mind that that study was only women that had severe osteoporosis. And there are doctors who then say, oh, well, if you have osteopenia or even if your bones are normal and you have a family history, we should throw you on Fosamax anyways. And I'm telling you that, in my mind, is medical malpractice because there's no indication. And in fact, there's every indication that actually giving somebody that has osteopenia Fosamax makes them more susceptible to osteoporotic fractures down the road. So there's another way of evaluating the effectiveness of a study using statistics, looking at the statistics of the study, and it's called number needed to treat. And I'm telling you, it is my personal mission in life to make everybody understand and ask their doctor about this. And let me tell you that if you go to a doctor and he says, hey, I want you to take drug X because it's going to lower your, percentage of whatever he wants to treat on you by X amount, you should say to him or her, what's the number needed to treat with that study? And if that doctor doesn't know this concept or what it is, you got to get yourself a new doctor. That's all there is to it. Because a doctor that doesn't understand this concept is a doctor that is, one, keeping their head in the sand, and two, isn't equipped to help you appropriately. I know that's a bold statement, and I'll stand by it. The number needed to treat asks a very simple question, and it's common sense. That question is, how many people need to be treated over what period of time for one person to get a benefit from that drug? In this case, we're talking about a reduction in fractures due to osteoporosis. Okay? So that same study that drug reps are going around saying will reduce your risk of having a fracture by 56%, the number needed to treat in this study is 81. What that means is you have to treat 81 people for 4 years with Fosamax for one person to avoid getting a fracture due to osteoporosis. And again, I want to point out that that is 81 people who already have severe osteoporosis. So when you hear the numbers in that way, that's a little bit different than a 56% reduction in fractures, right? And the cost and the side effect profile of those medicines, it just doesn't make any sense. It really is basically useless unless you happen to be that one in 81 person, one in those 81 people. The numbers for reclassed are even worse. The number needed to treat is actually 91 over a 3-year period. Now, reclassed is that more exciting, supposedly new drug where you get an injection once a year as opposed to taking a medicine once a day or once a week. And the numbers are actually worse. The number needed to treat is actually 91 over a 3-year period. So the bottom line is that the bisphosphonates may have some value in women who have already had a hip fracture in preventing additional hip fractures. Other than that, this entire line of drugs pretty much useless. So what would be the right question? If in medicine we ask the wrong question, what would be the right question? I know it should be obvious to us, right? The right question is, what can we do to increase the building of bone? If we would just have asked that question in the very beginning of realizing this problem, we would have a completely different set of medicines and a completely different set of activities and changes to make that would really result in seeing osteoporosis go away. Really is that simple. And it goes back to homeostasis because I'm telling you that bone loss is nothing more than homeostasis in action. So there are 3 factors that affect bone loss in every one of us. Number 1 is instruction to build. You've got osteoblasts, you've got these bone builders, and you have to give them the instruction to build. Number 2, they need the materials to build. If you tell them to build, but you don't give them the materials, they can't build. If you tell a bunch of workers to build a house, but you don't give them brick and mortar and nails and boards, then they can't build the house. And number 3 has to do with the acid-alkaline balance in your body, and I'll explain that one in more detail. So let's go through each one. First off, instruction to build. So the first thing is weight-bearing exercise. When you stress your bones, the body responds by saying, oh, my bones need to be stronger and more flexible. So when you stress your bones, that's one of the things, that's the whip that tells the osteoblast, hey, you, get to work, do your thing. What are different weight-bearing exercises? Obviously, lifting weights. Activities like Tai Chi and yoga are very good. Is there a benefit to walking as far as osteoporosis goes? The answer is there may be, and it has to do with the manner that you're doing the walking, because if there is benefit from it, it comes from the pounding that your feet do on the ground that causes a little shock to the bones. And that's, again, another way that the body says, oh, my bones need to be stronger and more flexible from that shock. So if you're on that glider or if you're on a soft treadmill, I'm not saying you shouldn't do those exercises. They're good for your heart, good for your girlish figure, but really they don't build bone as well. Bicycling, swimming, they're not weight bearing, and you do not build bone from those activities. You have to lift weights that are more than what your normal lifting is. You have to do activities. So, gardening, if you want to walk, put a weight vest on or put on a knapsack with some rocks or some books in it. Then you've increased the weight a little bit. Then you've turned that more into a weight bearing exercise. Number two is that targeting specific areas benefits those specific areas. This is what studies have shown. So with osteoporosis, what are we concerned about? We're concerned about our hips and we're concerned about our back, our spine, lower spine especially. We get those stress fractures in our vertebra. And so exercises that are specifically targeting those areas will help benefit those areas the most. So if you're lifting weights, you should be doing some leg lifting as well, either on those machines or some, get one of the things you can do is get one of those ankle weights that wraps around your ankle with Velcro. You can get them at Dick's or whatever. And then you go do your walking. And then not only have you increased the weight bearing, but you've also targeted your hips, which have to work harder to lift that weight. And that's how you can shore up your hips as well. And then number three, the earlier the better. And what I mean by that is that the younger you are when you start these activities, the easier it is to stave this off down later on in life. And that makes perfect sense, because if you're in your 20s, and the reason I say this is because we probably don't have too many people in our 20s listening right now. But our kids can be that age or younger. And when we start to set down those habits, right, earlier, then we see the benefits later on. And so if you're in your 20s and 30s and you're lifting weights and you're making stronger, more dense bones, it's harder for those bones to get beat up as we get older. That's what I mean by the earlier the better. And all of those things will result in stronger, more flexible bones. Number two, how about those materials to build? So, number one, there's the minerals: calcium, magnesium, strontium. So, with calcium, there's two things I have to say. Number one is that of the minerals that you need to build bone, the one that you are least likely to be deficient in is calcium. We get it in our diet a lot from the foods that we eat and from foods that are fortified with calcium. The other thing I want to say is that there's different forms of calcium. So if you're going to supplement, and I'll talk about this a little bit later with supplementing, but if you're going to supplement with a form that your body will use efficiently. When your doctor tells you to get 1,200 milligrams or 1,500 milligrams of calcium every day, that is a useless recommendation. It doesn't mean anything. And the reason is because if you take 1,500 milligrams of calcium carbonate, your body doesn't absorb it. It only absorbs about 10%. So 1,500 milligrams of calcium carbonate is not as effective and doesn't mean as much as 1,500 milligrams of calcium citrate, which your body absorbs and uses a little bit more efficiently. And neither of those things equate to if you're using other forms of calcium, like microcrystalline hydroxyapatite, which I'll talk about with the supplement part. So all those recommendations for calcium are basically useless. Calcium carbonate is also known as oyster shell calcium. So if you're taking Oscal, or if you're chewing one of those little Viactive chewy squares, or if you're using Tums because you saw in a commercial and your doctor saw in a commercial that it's a great source of calcium, your body's not absorbing and making use of that calcium pretty much at all. And the reason is because you need an acidic environment in your stomach to absorb calcium carbonate. But what is calcium carbonate? It's an antacid. That's why it's TUM. That's why it's in TUMS. And so it creates a non-acidic environment. And so even though it is a source of calcium, and they can legally say that, that doesn't mean that that makes it into your blood or into your bones at all. Magnesium, that is the mineral that you are most likely to be deficient in. Some studies now estimate that better than 90% of the American population from their diet alone are deficient in magnesium. And that becomes an issue because of the foods that we eat. Some of them don't, we don't eat enough of the foods that are supposed to have magnesium in it, and we eat foods that actually rob the body of magnesium. But even more importantly is, even if you are eating those foods, the way that we do things in agriculture these days, they don't have the magnesium content that they used to have even 30 or 40 years ago. So magnesium's job in the body is to make bones more flexible and stronger, and that is really, really important when it comes to fractures, almost regardless of the density. If your bones are more flexible, you're less likely to have a break. Another mineral, strontium. You may have heard of this. Dr. Oz is talking about it, and anytime Dr. Oz talks about something on TV, we get dozens of phone calls here in the office about it. There's not one mineral, there's not one nutrient that you're missing that's going to fix this problem for you. It's a combination of all these things together. Strontium can be important. I do use it as a supplement, either in combination or by itself, in addition to other nutrients. What it does is sort of similar to calcium and helps shore up the bones. And there are studies showing increases in bone density from using strontium as well. Then there are vitamins. Vitamin D, very, very important. I will refer people to the webinar archive. I did a really nice webinar about vitamin D about 6 months ago, so it's there and you can hear all about it. The only thing I'll say here is that, number one, your vitamin D levels have to be higher than they are. And if you're going to supplement with vitamin D, it should be vitamin D3, which is the natural vitamin D. Your body uses it more efficiently than vitamin D2, which is the synthetic. Vitamin K, that helps activate osteocalcin, and osteocalcin is the main non-collagen protein in bone matrix. So that's part of that matrix that the collagen sort of fills in between. And so vitamin K is important for that. Boron, that helps convert vitamin D into its active forms. And so that's what makes vitamin D more effective. And then vitamin D helps control the absorption and distribution of calcium throughout your body. Some of the B vitamins are very important because homocysteine is an amino acid that is a risk factor for osteoporosis. It actually interferes with the collagen cross-linking, making those bones stronger and more shored up. There's other nutrients like fish oil, help cells communicate with each other, and that cannot be underestimated. And there are studies showing fish oil affecting osteoporosis. So all of these materials to build, when supplied, result in stronger, more flexible bones. And then there's the the acid alkaline balance. Let's see. I got a question, sorry, from Jenna here. Jenna, sorry, I inadvertently deleted that question while I was trying to click on it. So could you type that in again for me, and then I'll address it right away. Sorry about that. So then there's the acid alkaline balance, and this is really very key to understand, and this is the homeostasis part of all of this. So the beginning of the story is that the pH of the blood has to be maintained in a very narrow window. Your pH of your blood has to be in a very specific amount. And if the body sways from that specific pH, even very minor amounts, you will die. And so the body has very keen mechanisms to maintain that pH of your blood. Okay, sorry, Jenna just asked, is vitamin D3 or vitamin D2 better? She didn't catch it. It's vitamin D3, which is also called cholecalciferol. That is the natural vitamin D that you want. Vitamin D2 is called ergocalciferol, and you do not want that. And you will find that it's a little bit less expensive as a material, as an ingredient. And so you'll find that in some vitamins, some multivitamins like Centrum or One a Day. And then you'll also, the prescription medicine that's vitamin D is actually synthetic vitamin D as well. Okay, so back to the pH. The body has to maintain the pH of the blood in a very narrow window. So there are foods that acidify your body and cause the blood pH to sort of sway away from that. What are those foods? Animal proteins, grains, sugar, alcohol, caffeine, And stress, I put that in there even though it isn't a food, it does affect the acid alkaline balance of the body. All of those things are acidifying. Now look at those things. That's the standard American diet right there. That's why we have such a problem with osteoporosis in this country. There are foods that alkalinize. Those foods are fruits and vegetables. And pretty much any fruit or vegetable. So even if the nature of the vegetable or fruit is acidic, like pineapple, pineapple is one of the most alkalinizing foods that you can eat. Its result in the body is to alkalinize things. Now, if you have habits that are more acidifying than alkalinizing, and your body is too acidic, it only has one choice to help fix that problem: borrow minerals from the bones. Those minerals are buffering. Those minerals are alkalinizing. So the standard American diet leads to things that are too acidic, and the body has to borrow minerals from the bones to fix that condition. Homeostasis in action. I hope you guys are understanding this and getting this. Homeostasis in action. We think of our bones as our structure, and it's here to keep us upright and to hold our body together. But actually, another very important function of bones is to act as a repository for minerals in an emergency. And when we have the standard American diet, it's constantly telling the body there's an emergency going on. Alarms are going off, and we have to borrow minerals from the bones to maintain the pH of our blood. It really is that simple. So if you are too acidic, you need to make some adjustments in your diet. Now, I've had people say, well, wait, I'm vegetarian, so I don't have animal proteins in my diet, and so I must not be acidic. And it's not necessarily true, because look at the second thing, grains. Many vegetarians just replace meat with pasta and cereal. And those are also acidifying to the body. I know some vegetarians who, are vegetarian for political reasons, who don't happen to like vegetables very much, and that is a problem. So can you measure this? Yes, you can. There's a process that you can do where you measure your urine. You can get little pH paper, litmus paper from the pharmacy. We actually have one that's available if you want to, get it. And what you do is your first morning urine, you collect after you've been asleep for at least 6 hours, and you test the pH of it. You'll get a number. You do that for 3 mornings in a row, and that is a good indication of where you are. And so urine should be slightly acidic. It should be somewhere between 6 and 6.5. Its pH should be somewhere between 6 and 6.5. And if it's lower, meaning more acidic, if your pH of your urine is 5.5 or 5, then that's an indication that you need to change the balance of this in your body. And you can experiment with this as well. You can do things to see what the result of certain activities and or foods or whatever have on this. And so, let's say you've done this and your first morning urine pH is 6. Well, on Saturday night, if you happen to go out and you party and, you binge a little bit on alcohol, test it on Sunday morning and see how much more acidic it is. And then you'll have a sense of how fluid this whole process is and how those things can change. So, as it turns out, your grandma was right when she told you to eat your fruits and vegetables and go out in the sun and play. That is the answer to osteoporosis right then and there. And it affects all 3 of those things that I just talked about. Eat your fruits and vegetables. So you're getting alkalinizing foods as well as getting minerals with those foods. You go outside and play. That means you're in the sun, you're making your vitamin D, and you're playing. You're using your muscles, which are making your bones stronger. And so grandma was right, and that's what you need to do. So, can supplements help? Yes, absolutely, supplements can help. You will never, ever, 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 ever hear me recommend for somebody to take a calcium supplement. I hope you'll understand why, because as I told you, calcium is the least likely thing that you're deficient in. What you need to take are bone mineral formulas, which are combinations of all of those nutrients, all of those materials that I just talked about. So here are 4 examples of that. And I will use any one of these formulas depending on what's going on with somebody and what their sensitivities and preferences are. So Bone Up by a company called Jarrow I like because it's in a capsule form and it's a good formula. Osteoplus by Progena, I like. It's in a tablet form, which means you don't have to take as many. With tablets, you can compress these, the molecules a little bit, and so there's less tablets than capsules. But the other reason I like this formula is that it has a really nice ratio of calcium to magnesium, more magnesium than some of the other ones do. If you're looking for something that's food source, then Bone Strength Take Care by New Chapter is really an excellent formula. I like this. If you look at the amounts of nutrients that are in there, not like you'll see in other formulas, but because they're food source, your body absorbs and uses them in a different way, more efficiently. Their pills have a tendency to be smaller, and so they're easier to swallow for people that don't swallow pills well, and they're very well tolerated. Some people don't tolerate bone mineral formulas very well. And for people that have hinky stomachs, the Bone Strength Take Care is a really great choice. And then there's this product called Pro Bono by Orthomolecular. And I like this one a lot. This is probably I call it the yuppiest of the formulas. It comes in a box with packets, and one pack in the morning, one pack in the evening, very complete formula. Really good, a little bit more on the expensive side, but we get really good results with that as well. Extra vitamin D3, very, very important. And again, go listen to that other webinar, and you'll find that you should have that blood level up into the 50 or 60 range. And for most of us, that requires supplementing more, usually around 5,000 units a day, every day, even in the summer. And then number 3, fish oil, very, very important, again, for helping cells communicate with each other and to cut down on inflammation in the body. And inflammation is one of those factors that also is acidifying and can sort of signal the body to, shunt minerals somewhere else other than the bones. And then number 4, I put down green food supplements, because if you are acidic and you're just not going to change your habits, then one of the things you can do is supplement with one of these green food supplements, which basically gives you the essence of lots of different fruits and vegetables, maybe many things that you wouldn't eat, like Brussels sprouts or kale or, whatever. And that will definitely help alkalinize your system. So you take a scoop of this stuff, it tastes pretty good. You mix it in some water, you drink it, and that will help alkalinize your system as well. So here's a little recap. And again, if you have any questions, now's a good time to type them in before we get to the end, and that way I can address them. So here's the recap. Number 1, this concept of homeostasis. The body will do what it needs to preserve life. And osteoporosis is the perfect example of this. And osteoporosis is nothing more than the body doing exactly what it's supposed to do based on the influences we give it from the outside world. The standard American diet is too acidifying. And because of that, the body has to constantly borrow minerals from the bones. That's what causes thinning of the bones. That's what makes the osteoclasts, the ones that break down bones, those little Pac-Men, work harder. Some people say, hey, wait, dairy is a good source of calcium. Well, I'm not sure whether it is or not. I know it has calcium in it. I don't know how well the body uses that form of calcium. But there are 2 facts that stand together. And if dairy were such a great source of calcium for us, these 2 facts could not stand together. Number 1, we have the highest dairy consumption in the world in this country. Number 2, we have nearly the highest osteoporosis in the world in this country. If dairy was such a great source of calcium, then those 2 facts could not exist together. And in fact, the women nurses study, showed that women that drink 2 glasses of milk a day actually have higher incidence of osteoporosis than women that drink 1 glass a day. So, and it's probably because even though there's some calcium in there, it's an animal protein and it's acidifying to the body. And so it's causing the condition where even if there is more calcium in there, that you're still asking the body to borrow minerals from the bones to buffer all of that. Again, a 3-pronged approach. Number 1, instruction to build. That's the weight-bearing exercise. That's the whip that tells those osteoblasts, do your job. Number 2, materials to build. Calcium, magnesium, vitamin D, boron, strontium, vitamin K, all those things together. And number 3, attention to that acid-alkaline balance. And there's those bone mineral formulas that we talked about. And for many of us, we can't just get enough of it from our diet. And so it's important to supplement with it as well. So I hope everybody enjoyed today's webinar. Upcoming webinars, as you can see, in July, we'll be talking about sports nutrition, optimizing your efforts. In August, we'll be talking about menopause and how to transition through menopause more gracefully. And then in September, we'll be talking about natural solutions for anxiety and depression. And this is an ongoing series. And in the past, we have done many other webinars. And so go to the website and explore. Cholesterol is a really good one, getting a good night's sleep, weight loss, stress, vitamin D. Here comes the flu again. Did a nice webinar about toxins in our system and our environment and detoxing. So again, last chance to sort of get some questions in there. Please do not hesitate to contact us here at the office if you have questions. I'm very open to answering those questions and helping you understand this further. If you happen to be on medicines and you want to know whether they'll interact with any of these supplements and or whether those medicines are really helping you, hopefully if you're on Fosamax, then you've gotten a different story than you got from your doctor today. And that's it. So again, the website, wellbeinggps.com. Thank you all very much for joining me. I do appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you guys in cyberspace again. Everybody, have a great day.